The Schilling Show continues here. It's a Throwdown Thursday edition. We welcome a longtime contributor to this program, John Guandolo, counterterrorism expert, a former FBI agent, the founder of UnderstandingTheThreat.com, and so much more. Also author of the brand new book, Islam's Deception, The Truth About Sharia. And John Guandolo, welcome to The Schilling Show. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Rob, it is always a pleasure to speak with you and your audience.
John, I wanted to start off a little differently than we normally do by playing a sound clip from a guest who was on the program last week. This was a guest who wrote a book. Her name was Asma Uddin, When Islam is Not a Religion, something to that effect. And we had a little conversation about Sharia law, and I want to play what she had to say, and then I'd love to get your take, because I kind of wished you were here in the studio when she was with me. So let's listen up, okay?
Yes.
Here we go.
And so the one that I look at is this claim made both explicitly and or at other times sort of indirectly that Islam is not a religion. It is instead a dangerous political ideology. And therefore, the claim goes, Muslims do not deserve religious freedom under our Constitution.
So let's respond to the people who are concerned about Sharia law and its supremacy to the United States Constitution, which is certainly espoused by some people in this country who are practicing Islam. How would you respond to that? And do you acknowledge that there are people who hold that position?
So the first thing I would say is that even the book is fundamentally about explaining the importance of and advocating for religious freedom for all. But as they make clear in the very, very beginning, when I say religious freedom for all, that is not the same thing as promoting a free-for-all. And I think that's where the misunderstandings come, because a lot of Americans who might be fearful or sort of uncertain about American Muslims and about Islam generally might just be like, well, if we give them freedom, they're going to end up taking over the U.S. They might institute Sharia law. And Sharia law is, of course, the definition, the idea of that is largely informed either by sort of really crazy headlines we read about stuff going on abroad, or, as I note in the book, the strategies and the output of a caterer of anti-Muslim agitators who are well-funded and whose job it is day in and day out to propagate these fears about Muslims. And a lot of Americans don't realize that they're actually sort of consuming this information from people whose job it is specifically to stoke fears. And so there's this fear, and we think that, we can't extend freedom because this is what's going to end up happening. But again, it goes back to the question of religious freedom being a legal concept, which means it is defined by our jurisprudence and our legal framework. And I explain in significant detail in the book that's exactly how that works when it comes to the question of Sharia or Islamic law, which I also dispute the sort of the equivocating between those two terms, because Sharia really refers to broad ideals, sort of following God's will, and it's really the jurisprudence, which is a totally different question that people are actually talking about when they say Sharia, but that's not Sharia, that's something else. It's called fiqh, F-I-Q-H.
Okay, let's leave it there. John Guandolo, there's a lot to digest, but I trust that you have some response to her contention that Sharia has been informed by crazy headlines, well-funded anti-Islam agitators.
Right. Well, I think to begin with, her comments are many of her comments are just objectively untrue, and I'd like to break it down.
Yes.
And since what she said about, quote, Islamic law and Sharia are objectively untrue, then the question is, what qualifies her to talk about this subject? Because she's objectively wrong, and let me break it down for your audience. Let me look at, I think what she said was, Sharia refers to broad ideals, just generally following God's will.
Yes.
So my question to her is, where is that taught anywhere in Islam, that's what Sharia is? Because it's not taught anywhere, nowhere. No Islamic school on the planet says that. As a matter of fact, oddly enough, I have open in front of me the most widely used textbook in U.S. Islamic schools for 11 and 12-year-olds, junior high schoolers, so actually up to age 14. And it says this: when you follow the Islamic way of living life, you are following the Sharia. Sharia includes all the do's and don'ts of Islam. The Sharia is the ideal path for us to follow. We learn what the Sharia contains from two primary sources. Do you remember what they are? They are the Quran and the Sunnah. And it goes on to explain what Sharia is. And let me read this quote. The basis of the legal and political system is the Sharia of Allah, page 381. The basis of the legal and political system is the Sharia law. And on page 2, it says, Islam is not a religion, however, but a complete way of life. Now, they're teaching this to 11-year-olds, which is also what the highest authorities in Islam have consistently taught for 1,400 years, that Islam is a complete way of life, social, cultural, military, political, and religious, all subordinate to Sharia. And Sharia is a barbaric system that calls for permanent warfare on all non-Muslims until every human on the earth is subordinated to Sharia. That's what it is. It demands crucifixion, beheading, amputation, banishment, whipping for crimes specifically listed in the Quran. So what she is doing is lying. Now, if she's not lying, then she is grossly ignorant and has no business writing a book or being on a radio program discussing things she's totally ignorant about. But since her father was a leader in the U.S. Islamic movement, then my guess is she knows exactly what she's talking about. She's lying. So those are my comments, and I will stand by them because there is no Sharia that's ever been authoritatively published that says what she says it is. And by the way, let me just add this.
Yes.
I've never said that Muslims don't have, American citizens who are Muslims don't have the right to freely worship. You can get on your knees or stand on your head and do whatever you want. But when your political system infringes on the unalienable rights of other human beings, which Islam necessarily does, then that's not a First Amendment or freedom of expression right. That's a political system. And everywhere that Islam has ever gone in history, it has gone as a political entity, and it has always waged war against non-Muslim political entities. That's the practical history of it. So, I would say to her, please spare me your bull.
John, I got to ask you, because she made some reference, I'm not sure it was in that soundbite, but during our conversation to, we see these things happening overseas as if they could never happen here, and probably referring to the things happening in the UK and in the European mainland. And I'd love for you to respond to that. Is it different here? Should we never expect those sorts of things that are going on over there, and we could even detail what they are, to happen here in the United States?
Right. So this illogical course of thinking says that America is apparently such a mystical place that enemy ideologies and political ideologies hostile to our Constitution can never take root here. That's not even philosophically honest. So I would begin with that. But let me remind your audience, and you and I have had several discussions about this, participants, actors in the Islamic counter-state, and she is one, in my professional judgment, that actors in this movement, their objective is to keep us off target until they reach where they need to reach. So they are, at this point, they feel that the Islamic movement in the United States feels they are at the precipice of victory. So all they're trying to do is keep us off target until they achieve victory here.
We should talk about what's happening in the UK right now, and if that is a lost society as it once was, because it certainly seems to be out of control, at least the reports that we're seeing. What do we know about that?
Well, in the United Kingdom, I will just to support what you just said, in 2009 when I was there, I had some briefings with some leaders, some members of parliament, some others, and my assessment to them in 2009, in the fall of 2009, was the UK is lost. And I just think now all we've seen in the last 10 years is that everything that we were seeing there play out as we briefed it would. And we had, quite frankly, even colleagues of mine that were very close friends, thought it was overblown. And then, of course, 2 or 3 years later, when things started to happen, and now they all think that we were right. But being right isn't what I'd like to do. The goal of the work we do is to try to get people to understand the threat, to act now before the only real solution is violence, because that means that's not a good way to, that's not a good problem-solving tool. That's, there are things we could have been doing 15 years ago in America that we haven't done. Things are bad in the UK. I don't believe it's salvageable without massive violence by the British government on the jihadi communities all over Britain, and I don't see anywhere in Britain that they have the gumption for that. So I don't see that working out well. But I could say that about probably 8 or 9 other European countries right now.
Is there anybody that has a handle on it that's acting prudently?
Oh yeah, I mean, Poland is. I would say they're pretty clear about what the problem is. They're very clear that the problem is Islam. And so they have had 0 terrorist attacks in the last 20 years because they don't let jihadis in the country. And that's their solution. You look at Czechoslovakia, Hungary, those places, especially Hungary, you've got leaders that openly declare, why would we let somebody in the country whose belief system is they're commanded by God to overthrow our government through all means, subversive or violence, why would we let them in our country ever?
John, I've got just a little over a minute left to wrap this up, and I'm going to direct people also to the website and the new book. But would you tell us what it is that the Trump administration needs to be doing immediately if they're listening in right now?
Well, I think, number one, they need to understand the threat and understand how pervasive it is in the United States. It is significantly advanced here. And because they're working with the Marxist movement here, the Marxist counter-state, it is the synergy between those two is it's advancing, it's accelerating. And to undermine that, people have to understand it at a deeper level than what you can get across in a 5 or 10 minute briefing. People actually got to come to full stop, sit down, understand where we are, and then create a strategy. You cannot create a successful strategy to defeat an enemy if you have no idea who they are, what their doctrine is, and how they're operating.
John Guandolo, if people want to get a copy of your new book, Islam's Deception, or if perhaps they'd like to invite you to speak at their church or at an event or the local law enforcement, how can we be in touch?
Well, our website is understandingthethreat.com. You can contact us through the website or email us at info at understandingthethreat.com. Please use our resources page. We have a number of DVDs and books, as well as we're literally today putting up our 2 videos on Sharia, which are approximately 5.5 hours total, and an hour-long presentation on the foundation of America, America's founding in law and government. So understandthethreat.com, putting freedom back on the offensive where it belongs.
John Guandolo, as always, thank you very much for standing up, and thank you for joining us today on The Schilling Show.
Thanks for having me, Rob. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.